Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with an answer to a question. One of you asked me, one of you wonderful watchers who writes such wonderful questions that gives me an opportunity to do what I do best, which is just let my mouth run off. You asked me, are there any conductors who had a really good track record, who seldom made bad records? And yes, there are. And I have a dozen of them. Now, there will always be qualifications with a question like this, won't there be? The question is, what is a great record? What is a great conductor? What is somebody who's never made a bad record? We know how subjective it's going to be. But this is a list which, with explanations, I think will give you a very good sense of who those conductors are. And I have to say right away, just initially, and wag my little finger here sanctimoniously, a lot of you look at these lists and comment without watching the videos because you see what the title of the video is, and then you see what the list is, and then you chime in without having listened to what I have to say about these people and how they got on the list and how they didn't. That makes some of your comments kind of irrelevant or not helpful given what the actual discussion was. And so I wind up deleting them. And it's so give me a break. Watch the bloody video. Of course, I can't say that because you haven't, and you know what I mean. But at some point, you'll see something from me saying, please watch the video before commenting, because then we'll have a more intelligent discussion, one which will be useful for others, which is the whole point of the comment section, right? We're creating a wonderful community of brilliant commentary. And I shouldn't have to work so hard to keep it that way, should I? Well, maybe I have to. Anyway, let's talk about the conductors, shall we? Here's the list. You ready? Number one. They're not numbered. They're in no particular order. Well, they are at the end. They are. They saved the best for last, I have to say. Or I think the best. Anyway, Ferenc Fricsay. I just did a big talk about the big Ferenc Fricsay box and the cubes that came before that, some of which were reviewed at ClassicsToday.com. One of the great conductors of the 20th century, a genius. He only had about 10 years of useful recording career, and almost everything he did is special. He did extraordinary Mozart, Stravinsky, Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, and Dorvague and Liszt, and really, really amazing stuff. Most of his recordings are in mono. That you have to keep in mind. And the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra was not always the best band when he had them. When he had the Berlin Philharmonic, he was in somewhat better shape. But wow, incredible. His Bartók is amazing. Hari János, is it the best ever? Probably. It's really hard to find a recording by him that isn't special in some way. And so I don't think anybody's going to argue with his position on the list. Next, this one may surprise you. Charles Groves. Charles Groves was an English conductor, spent most of his career in Liverpool. There's a box of Charles Groves stuff, a dozen or so, or 15 CDs. And they're pretty wonderful. But his discography consists almost entirely of less familiar stuff. Delius, weird Elgar choral music, things that nobody else was doing, Havergal Bryan symphonies. I think that it's hard to say that you can sort of base your career on doing that repertoire and get the recognition that you probably deserve. But Groves, you can tell listening to Groves, there is a joy in music making when you hear Charles Groves' recordings. There just is. There's something special about the man, about his ability to transmit that passion for the music, whatever it happens to be. And I think it's harder to transmit it in Havergal Bryan symphonies than in Beethoven. And it's an extraordinary legacy. It really is. He's a wonderful, wonderful conductor. It may be that if he had lived to run around doing all the normal standard repertoire, we would not feel that way about him because we would be comparing his Beethoven cycles to other people's Beethoven cycles. But we have what we have, and what we have is really special. And there really aren't any duds in the lot. And he was working with a very second-tier orchestra at the time that he had playing really, really well. There's really a special thing there. And so he makes my list. He really does. Next, Herbert Blomstedt. Now, I don't think anyone's going to argue about Herbert Blomstedt because he's a fabulous conductor, one of completely self-effacing modesty, but he's selective in his repertoire, and he chose the repertoire that suits him particularly well. Scandinavian repertoire, Grieg, Sibelius, and Nielsen, which he does incomparably. Choral music like Carmina Burana, the Brahms German Requiem, stuff like that, he does sensationally well. And where he's gone outside of his Fach, like to the Mahler 2 or Strauss tone poems, he got extraordinarily fine results. The Blomstedt box on Decca is amazing. It has a lot of the best of his work, but the rest of the best of his work was with the Staatskapelle Dresden. It was recorded by East German engineers. It was available either on Berlin Classics or now Brilliant Classics or on Denon, and some of that stuff is amazing too. Now, he could be a snooze. His Bruckner cycle with the Gewandhaus was boring. And when we say almost never made a bad record, it applies to all of these people. And in addition, I think we have to give Blomstedt, who's like 90-something, mid-90s and still conducting, we have to give him the decrepitude pass. You know, conductors get the decrepitude pass when they've had a fabulous career and they're still working well past the time when they should have retired, because they never retire. They work these people till they drop dead. And I hope they're happy doing it. But the fact of the matter is his later work has shown signs of frailty. Let us not kid ourselves. And I'm not counting that stuff. And there'll be other examples of that as well. But Blomstedt is definitely one of the great ones for what he did. And we always have to qualify it that way. It's for what he did. And he did wonderful Mozart, wonderful Beethoven. I mean, the guy was just a musician to his fingertips. Fabulous. Next, Karl Ancerl, the great Czech conductor. Karl Ancerl was an amazing thing there. He was a Holocaust survivor, wound up with the Czech Philharmonic. He brought it to extraordinary levels of achievement. His discography, again, isn't huge, but it's pretty substantial and pretty well varied. He was amazing, of course, in Czech music. He did an incredible Ma Vlast. He did premieres of works by Martinon. He did glorious Dvorak, the Dvorak Sixth. Wow. And the Requiem, incredible. His Stravinsky was non-pareil. Second to none. Absolutely incredible. His Symphony of Psalms and Oedipus Rex. And oh my God, it was great. His Shostakovich 10th is the greatest recording of that work probably that we have. Even something as simple and enjoyable as Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet ballet suites, he brought unrivaled intensity and passion to that music. Really laceratingly intense performances of that music. So he was special too. And the orchestra was special. And so that whole recorded legacy is just marvelous, absolutely marvelous. And Superphone recently released a multi-disc set of live stuff, radio broadcasts and things, which are also wonderful. There's just about anything you can listen to, anything that he did you can listen to and know that you're getting a certain level of quality, a level of intensity and purposefulness that's really very, very special. So Karl Ancerl, without a doubt. Next, this one will be controversial. Leopold Stokowski. Now, Leopold Stokowski introduces the element of taste. He made a bazillion recordings. Some of them are the worst ever, like his Brahms Third on Everest. Oh, God. He was weird in basic repertoire, but he was weird in everything. He was a law unto himself. However, here's the thing with Stokowski. He cared about what his records sounded like, and he ensured that they sounded the way he wanted them to sound. And he never failed to get what he wanted to get. So if you look at Never Making a Bad Record as somebody who achieved what his intentions were, or what their intentions were, his or her intentions were, then Stokowski was unquestionably one of the conductors who never made a bad record because they represented him. Now, you may have liked the hymn or you may have detested the hymn. And his discography is enormous and it's all over the place on every conceivable label. But he brought more music to the attention of more people than any other conductor who ever lived. And that goes without saying. I mean, his dedication to contemporary music, his premieres of things like Charles Ives' Fourth Symphony, and God knows what else. He never met a modern composer he wouldn't play, practically. His Bach transcriptions, the things that he did, really an extraordinary career. And he also gets the decrepitude bonus, although up till the very end of his life, he did amazing things. I mean, his Brahms Fourth was astonishing. It was like the last recording or one of the last recordings he made when he was 163 or something. Really, really a phenomenal artist. And you will either like him or detest him because he monkeyed with texts and he fooled around, but he was part of a generation of romantic conductors where that was considered much more acceptable than it is today. And so I have to give him props for what he did shamelessly and heroically and with a genuine feeling for the quality of the result, whether that be perverse or brilliant or genius. He deserves to be on the list. Next, Jean Martinon. Now, Jean Martinon was the opposite of Stokowski. He was a composer-conductor, but a wonderful, wonderful, sympathetic musician, also with an astonishingly wide range of stuff. Now, Martinon is best known these days for his Debussy and Ravel, which are reference cycles of both composers. They really are. And he did them again in France without having a fabulous orchestra at his disposal, but the performances are amazing for their insight, for their transparency, for their clarity, for their intensity. Yes, even that. But if you listen to the other things that he did, I mean, he did a great Nielsen 4. He did phenomenal contemporary music. His RCA legacy is astonishing. There isn't a dud in the lot. He did Verez. He did some of his own music. He was a pupil of Roussel, who he conducted with unbelievable security and excitement. And, later in his career for Irado, he did a whole ton of unusual French repertoire, 20th century French repertoire, which has never been surpassed, including those Roussel recordings. But he did the complete Saint-Saëns symphonies. He did not do, rather interestingly, classical repertoire. He did not do Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart. He did later French Romantic music and contemporary music. And in that field, he was amazing. Now, he did make some early recordings for Decca, some of which were okay and some of which were marvelous, but some of them were just not great. The orchestras at the time weren't always great, and the repertoire that was chosen perhaps wasn't as congenial to him as the later stuff that he did. But as he evolved as a conductor and developed as a conductor, he had an almost perfect record for musical wonderfulness for each disc. And so he certainly belongs on the list. And after Martinon, another perhaps controversial choice, but I stand by it, and that's Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein was unquestionably the greatest of the marquee conductors of the second half of the 20th century. The mega greats, the big names. When you talk about Karajan and Schulte and, all those people, Bernstein was, I think, the greatest of the lot. You are more likely than not to find a fabulous performance by him, an exciting performance by him. And then he was another conductor who expanded our range of music, because if you look at his full discography, it's astonishing how much he did. I mean, Sibelius cycles by Mahler. Mahler, of course. Haydn, the greatest Haydn conductor of the 20th century. He was. Sibelius, amazing. Nielsen, half amazing. Some was great, some didn't come out so well, but he did it. He did it at a time nobody was doing it. Then all of his American music, his Copland, his own music, some of which are masterpieces. Roy Harris and Randall Thompson, and just an unbelievable broad musical range of passionate, spontaneous music making. Now, Bernstein also gets my pass of decrepitude. Now, he wasn't old when he died. He wasn't, but he burnt out. There's a guy who drank and smoked and screwed his way to complete oblivion at a comparatively young age. And so I give him credit for getting as far, doing as much as he did and getting as far as he did, because he leaves an astonishing legacy of really fantastic music making. Even his Schumann was great. His Mendelssohn was great. I know there are people who talk about, I can't stand Bernstein. He's so over-emotes and all. That's bullshit. That's the blather of people who haven't actually listened to what he achieved. and who don't have it in their heads, who don't have it current in their way of listening. Because when you compare Bernstein's recordings to those of other people doing the same music, you don't find somebody who was this, paragon of emotional excess. And you hear it from other conductors too. Blomstedt and Doch Nani, it's Bernstein with Mahler. It was like vulgar and excessively emotional. When was the last time they actually listened to those recordings and really follow those performances? You just can't say that if you really have listened to what he did. You can't. So yeah, his late period for Deutsche Grammophon featured grotesquely slow tempos and horrible eccentricities and things that are best forgotten. But at his prime, most of his Sony legacy, his early DG recordings, they really are an astonishing legacy and a tremendous body of quality work, sheer quality work, communicative immediacy and idiomatic expressive point. And how emotional he may have been has nothing to do with it. And I am so sick of hearing that crap when it comes to Leonard Bernstein. You have to listen. And if you listen, you're not going to come away with that impression at all. I guarantee it. I really do. So, Leonard Bernstein's on the list. Next, Sándor Végh. Now, Sándor Végh was, of course, the first violinist of the Végh Quartet. I talk about him all the time, too. He did that amazing set of Mozart serenades and other music. His discography is quite small and quite select because he made most of his recordings with the, Mozarteum, Salzburg, Academica, Camerata, Klapidopoulos, whatever it was, thing, that little group. So most of it is Mozart and Haydn and, classical repertoire. But it's extraordinarily fine. And he did do some other things. He did Schubert symphonies. He did Bartók. There's a whole series of live recordings that was released on Orfeo that has some remarkable stuff in it. It shows that everything he did had the same humanity, musicality, inherent expressiveness, just that effortless idiomatic expressiveness that you hear from musicians who are so comfortable with what they do and able to communicate effortlessly what the composer had in mind. His Mozart piano concertos with Andras Schiff, for example. Sándor Végh will always be a specialist choice in this list of conductors who almost never made a bad recording, but that doesn't change the facts. What we have is precious. It's not a lot, but it's precious. After Sándor Végh, another generalist, Leonard Slatkin. Now, Leonard Slacken these days is a grand old man. When he was much younger, I'll never forget how much crap he took from critics. He wasn't as exciting as, for example, Bernstein. His music making was somewhat plain Jane. He was, young, and he was American, and he wasn't going to get time of day from Europeans particularly. That was never going to happen. But his music making is as musical and smart and enthusiastic and powerful and warm and enjoyable and expressive. Is anybody out there? His tenure with the St. Louis Symphony was astounding. He made fabulous music of Vaughan Williams and Elgar in England, better than the English conductors by and large, I dare say. He was really remarkable. He had some bumps in the road. His Lyon recordings for Naxos of like Ravel and that stuff and Debussy, well, not too thrilling. The orchestra wasn't great. He didn't have a good recording venue to work with. Everyone has their bumps in the road. They really do. And you have to take that into account when making a list of this type, because no conductor has 100% control over what they do, even assuming they have some version of self-awareness and they know what their strengths and weaknesses are. Slatkin knows he doesn't do Mahler, except he did 1 and 2, and the second with St. Louis was fabulous for Tellark, but he doesn't record the things that he doesn't feel all that strongly about, it seems to me anyway. He hasn't done a lot in the classical repertoire, but when he did, he does wonderful Haydn symphonies. He did a great series of the London symphonies, and I saw him live lots of times because he was one of the great program makers that ever lived. He could put together fabulous concert programs, and that is a gift. I know that's not something I can talk about in terms of recordings, but I know that to be true. And his programming, which is full of American music and unusual music and off the beaten path music, reflects that. It really does. I mean, his Copeland recordings, the American album, amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. And you could always count on him to deliver a very, very high level of musicianship in whatever he did. Whatever he did, I think his heart was in it. Or his heart is in it, still is. I think he's the only person, yes, he's the only person on this list who is, no, not the only person. Herbert Blomstedt is still with us, sort of. But Slatkin is really with us a lot. And for many more years, I hope. He shows no sign of slowing down. And his music making, as witnessed by, for example, his latest Rachmaninoff Symphony Cycle on Naxos, is still stunning. Stunning. So he makes the list. Now, my big three are coming up now. I wouldn't say that they're better than the other guys. This is a purely personal feeling on my part. But here they are. Constantine Silvestri. Now, Silvestri also had a very limited discography, mostly on EMI, the Romanian conductor. He died young of cancer. So you've got a small box of like 15 discs, but wow, what a legacy that turns out to be. Everyone who hears it thinks it's stunning, with the single exception of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony that has a very odd rhythm for that opening fanfare. I'm not quite sure what he was doing there. But most of the time, 95% of the time, 96% of the time, he was amazing. And his live recordings are no less amazing, too. He also recorded a lot of stuff for EMI as a concerto accompanist and some amazing recordings in mono with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, like Tchaikovsky's Manfred. I did Shostakovich's 11th. And boy, with everything he did, he was a bit like Sándor Végh in the sense that everything he did just had this warmth and humanity and expressiveness, and it was all so, it just sounded like it mattered. It always mattered. His heart was there for everybody to see. And I don't mean in terms of any kind of emotional excess or showmanship. It was just in the way that the music felt like it was speaking to you. And that was remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And so Silvestri is definitely on the list. Last two. Next, George Szell. How could you leave him off? There's never been a conductor who achieved a level of high quality execution like George Szell. I mean, to that extent, he never made a bad record. There is nothing he did that falls below a certain level of excellence that he authorized. I mean, there are other things that he didn't authorize, but his actual discography is probably the highest quality discography in existence. It is unbelievable. And it's unbelievable in all the German standard rep that people care about the most. Mozart, Beethoven, his Haydn was incomparable as well. I mean, it was so different from Leonard Bernstein's, but right up there. Right up there. I mean, in classical repertoire. And although in his lifetime he was considered somewhat, well, maybe a little cold and a little bit, kind of like, a technician rather than a expressive, animal. It's kind of funny, isn't it, how the ones who are that way, like Bernstein, get criticized for being too expressive, and the ones who aren't that way, like Szell, get criticized for being too cold. They're all everything. Bernstein had the technical equipment to deliver. Szell had the expressivity to deliver. They did it by different means. I mean, that was the point. But Szell's recordings have withstood the test of time because of their intense musicality and astonishing virtuoso level of technical finish. I mean, technical finish in the best way. Technical isn't bad when it means balance, rhythm, timbre, dynamics. I mean, all of that stuff is there, and it brings the music to life. He could sound in his worst moments sometimes a little over-controlled, as in Janáček's Sinfonietta, or pieces that need to sound like they're just exploding all over the place randomly. But he was an astonishing conductor, and I don't think anybody can say that anyone had a better record than he did. He almost never made a bad record. However, my choice is someone who may surprise you, but I stand by this one absolutely, and I think that the recorded evidence bears me out. It's Charles Mackerras. Nobody gives him credit for doing what he did. But when you think about what he accomplished, the problem with Charles Mackerras is that he didn't have a standard orchestra and record label behind him for the largest share of his career. He was all over the place. And so his stuff appeared on different labels at different times, depending on what the repertoire was. Here was a guy who lived and breathed music. I mean, in every possible way. He was also a delightful human being, and I happen to have had the advantage of knowing him, somewhat, and meeting him a few times. But that has nothing to do with it. I mean, I had that advantage and that pleasure because I knew who he was and thought what I thought, not because he talked me into it or because I had a personal relationship with him, which I didn't really. I mean, not in that sense. We weren't pals, But wow. What a genius he was. Consider that he was one of the linchpins of the period instrument movement and one of the few conductors who was able to do period instruments before there were period instruments and when there were period instruments, and equally well with both. He could get any orchestra to make any kind of sound he wanted effortlessly. He was as fabulous at Mozart and Haydn and Bach and Handel as he was at Janáček and Stravinsky and the Czechs. I mean, he put Janáček on the map, recorded all the Janáček operas, and what most people don't give him credit for is he made the Vienna Philharmonic sound like a Czech orchestra. Really an astonishing accomplishment. He made them play with linearity and leanness and rhythm, and none of that sloppy Viennese, schmoozy schlag stuff. And he didn't. His Elgar, his Delius, his English music, he could do anything, absolutely anything, and do it astoundingly well. He made 2 fantastic Beethoven cycles. 2! He did all the Mozart symphonies and the Mozart operas. He was an astoundingly fine opera conductor in the pit. He did all of those operas in English. He promoted unusual Handel. He did Gilbert and Sullivan amazingly. He wrote a ballet based on Sir Arthur Sullivan's music, Pineapple Paul. He was the complete musician, the completest musician I have ever known or heard. And it would be so wonderful if somehow from outer space they could collect all of his recordings for every label he ever worked with and just issue a box. It would be one of the most astounding, rewarding, profoundly satisfying recorded legacies, I mean, possibly the most that has ever been done. He was really, really that special. And I consider it a privilege to have known him, and it is still a privilege for me to be able to listen to him. His recordings should be in print forever. I mean, he could do Sibelius as well as he could do Shostakovich. It just didn't matter. It all came out sounding great. And that is the point of this entire talk. So that's my list, friends. You may have some other people you want to throw on it. I am open to suggestion, but I think this 12 is a pretty complete list of what we have available to us now. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.